They said he was dangerous for doing everything legally. On a Saturday in Minneapolis, January 24th, 2026, Alex Pretty is dead. He was 37 years old. He was lawfully carrying a firearm. And within hours, the federal government locked in a story that turned those facts upside down. A man described as a good Samaritan was reframed as a threat. Not because of what he did, but because of what he had. That contradiction matters to you, because if lawful behavior can be reclassified after the fact, then legality isn't protection anymore. It's conditional. Today it's an immigration operation. Tomorrow it's a protest or a traffic stop or a moment where you step in thinking you're doing the right thing. The administration didn't open with questions. It opened with certainty. The agents were right. The civilian was wrong. And the faster that narrative hardened, the smaller the space became for anyone asking uncomfortable questions. But here's where the story quietly turns. To justify what happened, they didn't just defend the agents. They redefined the meaning of lawful carry itself. What happened next wasn't treated as an isolated incident. It was framed as routine. According to the official line, federal immigration agents encountered Alex Pretty during an altercation, saw that he was armed, and responded with lethal force. The key phrase repeated afterward was simple and strategic. He was lawfully carrying a firearm, but his conduct was recast as dangerous anyway. That's only part of the picture. This wasn't just about one shooting in Minneapolis. It immediately became a stress test for the administration's own coalition. On one side, the law and order base that backs aggressive immigration enforcement. On the other, gun rights supporters who believe lawful carry is non-negotiable. The response from the White House didn't try to balance those interests. It chose. Instead of slowing down, officials moved quickly to seal the interpretation. The focus wasn't on whether lethal force was necessary. It was on why Pretty's legal behavior could still be framed as a threat. That framing turns a single encounter into a precedent. So here's the question that reframes everything. If legality doesn't protect you in the moment it matters most, what exactly does it protect you from? Here's the claim that sits at the center of this story. The administration decided that the fastest way to justify the killing was to turn ordinary gun carry into evidence of criminal intent. And they didn't do it quietly. Multiple senior officials stepped into the narrative immediately. FBI Director Kash Patel, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. That last name matters. Treasury doesn't normally weigh in on domestic shootings. Its presence signals something deliberate. This wasn't damage control by accident. It was coordinated. The message was consistent. The problem wasn't the shooting. The problem was what Pretty had on him. Officials suggested that the mere possession of a firearm or even an extra magazine indicated nefarious intent. That phrase does a lot of work. It reframes preparation as menace. It implies that exercising a right is itself suspicious. Notice what's missing. There was no public emphasis on what Pretty actually did in that moment. No detailed description of an immediate threat. No explanation of why lethal force was unavoidable. The spotlight stayed fixed on the object, not the behavior. That choice matters. Because if possession alone becomes the justification, then the standard quietly changes. Lawful carry stops being neutral. It becomes a risk factor. And once that line is crossed, the burden shifts away from the state and onto the citizen. This is where the story stops being about Minneapolis and starts becoming something else entirely. Now watch how fast this escalates. What began as a single justification hardens into something broader. The logic spreads. If a legally armed civilian can be framed as a threat after the fact, then the rules don't just apply in Minneapolis. They apply everywhere federal agents operate. And that's the quiet shift taking place. There's a precedent here, even if no one wants to call it that. Not in law books, but in practice. When institutions feel exposed, they normalize extreme responses to protect themselves. Over time, what once required extraordinary justification starts to feel routine. The presence of a firearm becomes enough. Context fades, nuance disappears. The dangerous part isn't the shooting itself, it's the normalization that follows. When officials repeatedly imply that lawful carry inherently creates danger, they reset expectations, not for criminals, for everyone else. Carrying legally stops being a protected act and starts being treated as a provocation. Here's why that matters. Once something is normalized, it no longer needs to be explained. It only needs to be enforced. And enforcement doesn't ask whether you meant harm. It reacts to what it's been trained trained to fear. This is where the story flips, because what's being defended isn't just one decision made in seconds. It's a new default, and defaults are powerful. They shape what happens next without ever announcing themselves. Here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. As officials intensified their defense, the evidence they leaned on grew thinner but louder. The most disturbing claim to surface was that Alex Pretty's possession of an extra magazine was used as proof of nefarious intent. Not something he said, not an act he committed. Equipment, standard legal equipment. The implication was clear. Preparedness itself was framed as suspicious. At the same time, the administration publicly positions itself as a defender of gun rights. That tension is the tell. On one hand, speeches and platforms celebrating the Second Amendment. On the other, a media tour attacking the legitimacy of lawful carry when it intersects with federal authority. This is the moment that permanently changes how you have to see the issue, because the justification isn't accidental, it's strategic. If Pretty remains a lawful carrier and a good Samaritan, then the agent's actions demand scrutiny. If his equipment can be turned into a symbol of threat, then the shooting becomes justifiable by default. Notice what they didn't say. There was no admission that lawful carry complicated the situation. No acknowledgement that rights can exist alongside risk. Instead, the right itself was quietly recast as the risk. That inversion is powerful. And once it's accepted, it doesn't stay contained to one case. It becomes a template, one that can be reused whenever the state needs it. Everything starts compressing at once. First, a federal prosecutor steps in and says the quiet part out loud. Bill Sahel, a senior U.S. attorney, states publicly that if you approach law enforcement with a gun, there is a high likelihood they will be legally justified in shooting you. That's not a comment about Alex Pretty anymore. That's a rule. A blanket assumption. Presence equals permission. Second, gun rights organizations react, but carefully. The NRA calls the statement dangerous and wrong. Gun Owners of America labels it untoward. Strong words, but notice the target. The criticism is aimed downward at a prosecutor, not upward at the administration that set the tone. Third, the administration doesn't correct the record. There's no walk back, no clarification. Silence does the work instead. The message holds. Stack these together and the pressure becomes visible. Legal theory hardens into operational guidance. Advocacy groups signal alarm but stop short. And the federal government allows the interpretation to stand. This is what loss of control looks like in real time. No single announcement, no formal policy, just a cascade of statements that, taken together, redefine the risk of lawful behavior. So here's the question that hangs in the air now. What happens if this continues? Now pull the camera back to where you are. Because this isn't abstract. If you're an ordinary person, the takeaway is unsettlingly simple. You can follow the law, you can carry legally, you can think you're acting responsibly, and none of that guarantees safety when federal authority enters the scene. The rules you thought protected you may not matter in the moment they're tested. Imagine how that changes behavior. People hesitate, they don't intervene, they don't help. The Good Samaritan instinct gets replaced by calculation and fear, not because the law changed on paper, but because enforcement did. Residents in Minneapolis didn't respond with relief after the shooting. They responded with fear. That detail matters. It tells you the reassurance campaign failed at ground level. And this isn't about ideology. Strip that away. What's left is lived consequence. A right that exists in theory, but carries unpredictable risk in practice. A moment where doing nothing feels safer than doing the right thing. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because that hesitation, quiet, internal, unspoken, is how trust erodes without a single vote being cast. And once that erosion starts, it doesn't stay local. It spreads. And the system that depends on public cooperation starts to wobble. To understand how this keeps happening, you have to look past the outrage and into the machinery. This isn't driven by ideology. It's driven by incentives. Federal agencies are built to preserve authority, minimize liability, and protect their operators. When something goes wrong, the system doesn't ask, what failed. It asks, how do we contain this? And containment starts with narrative control. In this case, defending the agents required shifting risk away from the state and onto the individual. That's the mechanism. If the civilian can be framed as inherently dangerous, then the use of force becomes preemptive rather than excessive. The system rewards that framing because it reduces scrutiny, lawsuits, and political fallout. Spectacle plays a role too. A high-profile shooting creates pressure for clarity, not complexity. Simple stories travel faster. Armed man equals threat is easier to sell than a nuanced discussion of rights, context, and judgment under stress. Fear compresses debate, and compressed debate favors power. Here's the unsettling insight. Systems don't need to hate a right to erode it. They just need to treat it as an operational inconvenience. Once that happens, the right still exists on paper, but its exercise becomes conditional on the state's comfort level. That's not a conspiracy. It's how large institutions behave when they feel exposed, and it sets the trajectory for what comes next. From here, the path splits, but neither direction is stable. One path is quiet continuation. The administration holds the line. The agents are cleared. The rhetoric fades from headlines but stays embedded in practice. Lawful carry remains legal, but increasingly risky around federal operations. Gun groups grumble, issue statements, then refocus on courts and elections. Nothing explodes. Motivation slowly drains instead. Turnout softens. Energy dissipates. The other path is escalation. Pressure builds as more details circulate. Lawsuits move forward. Gun rights advocates stop targeting proxies and start pointing upward. The contradiction between campaign rhetoric and enforcement behavior becomes harder to ignore. Each new incident compounds the last. What was defensible once starts to look like a pattern. Notice the uncertainty. Neither outcome requires a dramatic announcement. Both are already in motion. The deciding factor isn't a law or a ruling. It's whether the people who feel betrayed decide to disengage quietly or confront the contradiction openly. Momentum matters here. Once a base stops believing it will be protected in practice, not just promised protection in theory, the relationship changes, and those changes tend to surface late, all at once, when it's hardest to reverse them. The next move isn't public yet, but it's forming. Here's the insight that ties the whole story together. Alex Pretty wasn't just a man caught in the wrong place. His death exposed a limit. The limit of how much contradiction a political coalition can absorb before trust starts to fracture. A government can praise a right, appoint judges who protect it, and still undermine it in the moments that matter most. This story isn't about whether gun rights exist, it's about when they stop protecting you. When a right becomes something you're allowed to have, but not allowed to exercise without risk, its meaning quietly changes. That's the loop to pay attention to going forward. Because the same logic used here doesn't stay confined to one issue or one agency. It travels, it adapts, and it shows up wherever authority feels threatened. If you want to understand where this goes next, how these contradictions surface in future cases, and which signals actually matter, stay with this channel. Follow for the next layer of analysis. Because this wasn't an ending, it was a signal.